Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final panel of today's fascinating discussions, taking us through the last 75 years of Europe's history, and we will try to take a stab on our future next. My name is Katrin Harvey. I'm the Chief Operations Officer of the Ban Ki-moon Center. Our mandate at the Ban Ki-moon Center is to empower women and youth to become global citizens, making them catalysts for the Sustainable Development Goals. Our main pillars of work to achieving our personal mission is education, leadership, mediation, and advocacy. There is a table outside with a lot of information and brochures about our work, but myself and our two interns from Korea will be here during dinner if you want to talk about the Ban Ki-moon Center a bit more later on. Today we have an outstanding panel of experts with us here personally and virtually to discuss the future of Europe. Now we know that for those of us who were here this morning, it's very hard to predict the future. If you remember Heinz Fischer's speech, but we'll try, and we will want to find out if there is an alternative to universal and pan-European multilateralism. And during our conversation, we hope to revisit and recalibrate the European, Mediterranean, and cross-continental affairs, and to see where we're heading as a community. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first virtual panelist. It's Lamberto Sagnier, the former OSCE Secretary General, the current OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, and I hope he's online and ready to go.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having with you for this for this discussion. What I would like to do is put forward some considerations on why we are where we are based on the things I've seen during my career. Of course, I'm not old enough to go back the full 75 years, but I'll start in the mid-80s, and I'll start in Vienna. Vienna has been a constant point of reference in my career in many ways. So I was in Vienna in the early 80s, the very beginning of the 80s. And I was engaged at the time in an arms control negotiation called the MBFR, Mutual and Balanced Force Reductions. It was a NATO Warsaw Pact negotiation, very carefully scripted, very close coordination. There were speeches. This was in the Reduttensaal. They would meet once a week. And we would analyze every comma of the statement of the other side. That negotiation was considered a good form of dialogue between two alliances that were enemies, they were opposing to each other. But in the years that I spent there, I didn't think we moved an inch. We were talking, but we are not really communicating. At the same time, the OSCE had been created, or the CSE had been created in '75, but the CSE were going through some of the same difficulties at the time. There were events, it was a forum for dialogue and cooperation. It also involved the neutral and non-aligned countries of Europe at the time, so including Austria. But not much was happening until the mid-80s. Then things started to change. In the CSC, there were some initial measures of confidence building in the military field that were adopted at the conference in Stockholm. And then the CSC came in Vienna for one of its periodic review conferences. At that time, I was reassigned by the MBFR to the CSC to deal with the political side and the political military side, the security side of the work. And I could really see the change of speed. When there was a decision, I think that was one of the biggest displays of leadership that I've seen through my career, was the time of the Reykjavik summit, Gorbachev-Reagan's summits. We started seeing progress in arms control, the nuclear disarmament, the INF treaty with the disbandment and the elimination of full category of nuclear weapons in Europe. So it was really, things were really changing and moving. And the work in the OSCE was extremely, in the CSE, sorry, was extremely engaging. We were staying long nights, working, not in easy circumstances because of the differences were there, but the dialogue existed and the progress was there. We started an arms control negotiation, the mandate of the CFE treaty. And so we came, and this was the beginning of the big change of the end of the 80s. and the end of the Cold War. In the CSC, there was a new charter, a new starting point. It was called the Charter of Paris, a new vision of a new Europe of stability and all that. I was in Rome at the time dealing with, again, with disarmament things and the INF Treaty and some of these other things. And from there, I moved to Brussels. I went to NATO, and I was head of a department in NATO, dealing with arms control and cooperative security. And this was a good point of view for developments in terms of the new relationships in a new phase, in the post-Cold War era, where we started finding unexpected obstacles. There was an expectation that, you know, the transformation of internal borders into international borders in the former Yugoslavia and in the former Soviet Union would be a relatively automatic process. And of course it wasn't. It was very political, it generated conflict, societies disintegrated, very dramatic conflicts in the former Yugoslav space, but also in the former Soviet space, in places like Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia, etc. So this transformation of borders was not so easy and took place in a context where we started seeing a new kind of complicated relationship. And at that time, there was a big debate in NATO. What does all this mean for the alliance beyond the debate on how do we intervene in these conflicts and can we play a role to stabilize and to help out, etc., under a UN or OSCE was at the time mandate. What the key point in this debate is how will NATO relate to Russia in future? And there was in the first half of the 90s, there were those who were thinking we need to build a new relationship with Russia as a first step, and then we can really develop relations on the basis of that. But of course, the agendas didn't really match. On the NATO side, the Americans were repositioning themselves on their global agenda as the only remaining superpower, projecting stability through also promotion of democratic institutions, etc. And they tended to have a rather conservative view of what NATO should be in future, because it could be useful also to promote that agenda and, of course, to intervene in the new conflicts that were coming in. The Russians, on the other hand, first of all, there was a big internal debate in Russia. There were many that were still saw NATO as the former enemy, and so they were basically saying there is no need for NATO today. But there were others, especially the leadership, were willing to open a discussion, but the discussion about the future of NATO itself. So basically they were saying we could even consider joining NATO, coming very close to NATO, but then NATO has to change. What's the point of a military alliance or a defense alliance if we are all part of it? It should turn into a collective security instrument of some kind, where we all sit around the table with the same vote on this, and so turning NATO into something similar to what is the OSCE today. And this failed. This failed because the two visions were not, there was no way to reconcile them. And this failure, which then led NATO to go the other way, which was that of a progressive expansion into what used to be the space of the Warsaw Pact, that was seen by Russia as aggressive, as an expansion, because then the EU also started moving in that direction. They were saying the European institutions have not managed to develop a new relationship with us, and instead they are expanding in a way that is threatening for us. And then, of course, the reaction was for Russia to start establishing its own area of influence, or its own sphere of influence, as also as a reaction to that. And this took quite some time, and we come into the new century on this. In OSCE terms, because at that point I'd moved to the OSCE on arms control issues, we had a summit in '99 in Istanbul, where we still adopted a number of important decisions, including the adaptation of a CFE treaty, which was an old Cold War instrument that needed to be modernized. And we agreed, and this was signed by all heads of state and government of the American president, the Russian president were all there, and they signed all these things. But then they were never ratified in parliaments because they got complicated into complicated situations where they got linked with the resolution of the unsolved protracted conflicts that had arisen earlier, and the military presence in those conflicts and all that. And from there, the divisions in the international community only expanded until today. I saw that when I served for a period in Kosovo as an Undersecretary General of the UN. Actually, I was the special representative of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon there. He's the one who took me for that job. And the Security Council was really divided, as it is today, on the Kosovo issue. And it was difficult. I managed to pass a decision at that time, but it took quite an effort of discussion with all the sides to help the Europeans deploy in Kosovo, trying to give a European perspective to the solution of that. But otherwise, and then what I witnessed during my time as Secretary General, and during my tenure, we had also the crisis in and around Ukraine, Crimea, Donbass, and all these issues. Every step seemed to increase the distance between the sides and to bring more geopolitics into on the table. And I remember attending at some point a security conference in Moscow where I was on a panel with General Gerasimov, who was at the time the Chief of General Staff in Moscow, and he came up with a map at the conference, a very large map showing the deployments of NATO and basically concluding we are surrounded. NATO has really surrounded us from Turkey to Norway. It's a line, and bases are being opened, the missile defense things, etc. And so they felt, and he wanted to convey the point that they felt threatened, and this was not a stable environment. So the relationship has become increasingly sour. The mechanisms that have been established to deal with this have been working less and less. The arms control tools and all the other crisis management tools that we developed in the end of the 80s and during the 90s have fallen apart one after the other. And today we face a situation where we have a lot of potential of instability, and we lost on the way many of the tools that would allow us to address these problems of instability. I would like to jump back one moment because there is a second set of issues. And for that, I would go back to the 90s when we started talking about globalization, internet, and all these, and then early 2000s, September 11, the terrorism makes it on the front pages, and we start facing global challenges. And this is in addition or in a context where geopolitics are always more present. Now, global challenges keep developing kept developing over the last 20 years. Beyond terrorism and transnational organized crime, we started seeing more and more climate change, the migration crisis, and the migration crisis. In fact, it was addressed as a crisis in itself, but in fact, it was a very complex set of issues that it was bringing to life. First of all, something about which nobody feels comfortable talking because it is extremely difficult to address, which is a demographic crisis. If you think world population from the time when I was born to today has more than trebled. So it is really developing at a pace that is not sustainable in terms of resources between sheer numbers of population and resources available. And of course, this is creating economic differentials. So then the impact of the media puts it in front of everybody, the global media. Conflicts have become much more complicated. Interstate conflicts have almost disappeared. Conflicts come from within states. They're often embedded in problems within the societies. This is what I'm dealing now in my current job. That is, beyond the issue, the strict issue of the protection of minorities. It's really diversity within our societies, and the fact that the integration is not there, and the lack of integration makes societies less cohesive. Up to the pandemics, to come to the last point. And what we see is that all these challenges create two problems. First, countries react to them by closing up. We have seen on the migration crisis, the European Union has really entered the crisis of itself, a problem of what was perceived as a lack of common policy, lack of solidarity and all that, even in a solid framework like that of the European Union. The pandemics have led to closure of borders, really renationalization, even more of policies. So everybody looking for himself and what is the problem and all that, which is fully understandable, and it's easier also for politicians to sell in a way, but runs contrary to the notion that these are global problems and we need global solutions to global problems. And because of the first set of issues, because of geopolitics and of the competition, we see that it is very difficult. It is increasingly difficult to work on global strategies. Sustainable development is what we need today. We would need a very strong commitment by all governments on a global agenda of sustainable development, which touches on all of these aspects. But of course, geopolitical divisions make this impossible, and the renationalization of policies has led to a progressive disinvestment of countries on multilateral frameworks. In the OSCE, for instance, we have a shrinking budget all the time. There has been no way to keep the budget of the organization the level of real growth as it should be. So I'm saying even without growing, but keeping it stable, we need to cut back all the time as a result of mainly of lack of interest really of countries investing in frameworks like this. So the situation and the overall outlook is very bleak. We need to stick together to address challenges that affect us all. We are working against the tools that we had set up to work together, and we are dismantling them. We are making them less effective, and we see some of the key players are really engaging on the basis of very focused national priorities, sets of national priorities, national agendas. So what can we do? It's not easy to answer this, but certainly the ways that of creating coalitions, coalitions involving youth, first of all, because they are the ones who have the greatest interest in trying to make things work. But of course, youth as such are not organized. It's not easy to work with young people, even though we try to involve them in everything we do. Secondly, we need really to start talking about the need to invest in effective multilateralism, and maybe also the whole multilateral system has become too complicated. So there is a need for reform, but for the need for reform, you need also an investment and an interest, and the geopolitical side make these reforms more complicated. So the best thing we can do is to raise awareness. What I'm trying to do myself from my perspective today, that we have a problem, identify the problem, and then try to mobilize those who have goodwill and have some kind of manifestos, charters, appeals, also Nobel Prizes, people who have a credibility as of itself, take the lead, accept the responsibilities, go out and speak up and say, we need to act, we can't really go back to the old ways because this will lead us nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker would be Daniel James Johnston. He's the former Canadian Minister of State for Science and Technology, Minister of State for Economic and Regional Development, Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and I'm sure I forgot a few. And he was also, and most importantly, the former Secretary General of the OECD. Mr. Johnston is not here with us today. He's virtually present, and we have the honor of hearing Ms. Aisha Chankar from Slovenia, who is currently attending the Vienna International School and will graduate next year in May, to read some of his speech for us. So Aisha, please come to the stage.
You have my, can you hear me?
We can hear you well, and Aisha is going to read your speech to us now.
Yes, we made an arrangement, and my speech is considerably longer than what she's going to give. Yes. But I hope that we're going to have time for some questions and answers. But I would suggest that she begin, and I'd like to hear it well read, as we were afraid we'd have a glitch, and I think she's done some editing as well. So there it is.
Here we go. Here's Aisha now, everybody.
Addressing the future of Europe is invited.
Louder, please.
Is there any alternative to universal and pan-European multilateralism? For the purpose of my remarks, I am interpreting universal and pan-European multilateralism as moving forward with achieving more EU integration, supported by institutions appropriate to a kind of federal structure in line with the thinking of the Spinelli group. But it also raises the question of global free trade, which I promoted as Secretary General of the OECD and continue to believe must be the world's future in addressing poverty and opportunity, especially for the world's developing countries. But it has to be managed in a way sensitive to the challenges of both. In these brief comments, I intend to offer my view on the answer to this fundamental question about the future of Europe. To begin, I would amend the question by adding the word good before alternative. There certainly are alternatives, some of which could set Europe on a path back to a collection of independent sovereign states and undo the remarkable progress in building a secure European Union in the post-World War II period. Many years ago, when looking at the extraordinary work and vision of statesmen like Jean Monnet, trying to build a lasting and prosperous European Union, I came across a comment of British historian H.A.L. Fisher in the preface to his 1936 book, A History of Europe. In part, it read as follows: "No question would be more pertinent to the future welfare of the world than how the nations of Europe may best be combined into some stable organization for the pursuit of their common interests and the avoidance of strife." Fisher's vision of a strong, unified Europe remains very much work in progress, and that work really began with Jean Monnet's initiative to create the European Coal and Steel Commission. I will comment on that in a moment, but I remain convinced that Fisher was right, and the great rebuilding of Europe and the EU after the Second World War must and will endure notwithstanding the barrage of criticisms from Eurosceptics, now emboldened by the United Kingdom's Brexit vote of June 2016. Admittedly, my conviction is based on the EU having strong visionary leadership, which has not yet fully materialized. There are also others, especially President Trump, who appear to be hostile to the emerging global role that the European Union is likely to play as it completes its evolution to a unified international force. This has become even more important as the United States under Trump becomes increasingly isolationist and opposed to international multilateralism constructed by visionaries over the past 75 years. In a stunning commentary in Foreign Affairs, summer 2016, Professor Jakob Pigil of the Catholic University of America implies that the upside to the EU crisis will be a return to independent sovereign nation states across Europe. Indeed, that will be an upside for American isolationists. It will remove from US competition the largest unified single market in history and reinstate the possibility of future wars on the continent that this great European experiment was designed to prevent, as it has. Some of Kriko's comments appear designed to create a false impression of the views of Europeans. Here is a cheerful observation to support his thesis. A Europe of newly assertive nation states would be preferable to the disjointed, ineffectual, and unpopular EU of today. There's good reason to believe that European countries would do a better job of checking Russia, managing the migrant crisis, and combating terrorism on their own than they have done under the auspices of the EU. Really, what is that good reason that escaped the attention of the statesmen and nation builders like Jean Monnet in post-war Europe? Krikil also says that the EU is ineffectual, which is true in some cases, as it is with many, if not most, supranational bodies, including much of the United Nations activities. And what of the United States itself? Sadly, the world is watching that formerly great republic floundering in the face of numerous serious challenges, both social, economic, even racial, not even capable of effectively addressing the COVID-19 crisis through what is becoming a dysfunctional government under a commander-in-chief who proudly presents himself as a narcissistic, ignorant bully. Will others follow the United Kingdom over the cliff? Alina Polyakova and Neil Fligstein, writing in the International New York Times at the time of the Brexit vote, July 2016, relied on polls that suggest that will not happen. They say, Britain is not and never has been a typical member of the European Union, and in no country but Britain do populists and other Eurosceptic forces have the 51% of votes needed to pull their countries from the Union. Jacques Delors, who has dedicated much of his life to the European dream, both in public office and after retirement, through his Paris-based foundation, made the following observation in an interview in 2012 with the Handelsblatt newspaper. If the British cannot support the trend towards more integration in Europe, we can nevertheless remain friends, but on a different basis. I could imagine a forum such as European Economic Area or a free trade agreement. That might be the happiest outcome in the wake of Brexit. The real beneficiaries of Brexit are the remaining EU members inspired by people of the experience and quality of Jacques Delors and members of the Spinelli Group, the latter founded in 2010 as a network of thousands of politicians, individuals, writers, and think tanks looking to revive the momentum towards a federalist structure for the EU. In fact, the Brexit vote and Johnson's arrival as Prime Minister may have strengthened the resolve of many EU countries and prominent Europeans to accelerate the integration process in line with federalist thinking. Consideration should be given to some steps that must be taken to realize the collective potential of the EU as a major global player, which it could never be if its members revert to sovereign nation-state status. Indeed, as other major countries grow in economic clout, it has been pointed out that not even Germany would be in a new G8. Only a united EU could have influence on the global stage. A strong, unified Europe is also important for the emergence of global multilateralism and the further evolution of globalization. Since the end of the Cold War, we have been living in a world dominated by just one superpower, the United States. Fortunately, that superpower has been a very open market and largely, but not entirely, militarily non-aggressive. The American economy had enough strength and resilience to emerge slowly but with growing confidence from the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. To become a companion economic locomotive, Europe must continue to open its markets, eliminate distorting trade subsidies, and undergo substantial structural reforms in labor, services, and manufacturing markets to stimulate European economic growth. I hope that the results of the Europe 2020 exercise and its follow-up will help in that regard. If that does not happen, the United States must use its economic muscle to focus increasingly on bilateral agreements that are becoming a serious impediment to global free trade. If Europe had successfully moved to a more centralized and coherent federal model of government, it could have reached the objectives adopted by the EU in 2000, often referred to as the Lisbon Agenda, which was stated in the Lisbon Declaration, 24th of March 2000, as follows. The Union has today set itself a new strategic goal for the next decade, to become the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion. Well, that failed. The Lisbon Declaration is now replaced by the Europe 2020 strategy, which has 5 ambitious objectives related to employment, innovation, education, social inclusion, and climate/energy. The world would benefit greatly from Europe attaining those objectives. An expanded EU, which would evolve with Turkey as a major player, would have a much greater population and a much larger market than the United States. The objectives listed above can only be realized when the peoples of Europe achieve a consensus on what kind of legal community they truly wish to be. And so far, progress to that end has been in fits and starts. The failure of the Lisbon Agenda, the rejection of the proposed constitution in both French and Dutch referenda, and now the exit of the United Kingdom underscored the difficulty of moving toward a flexible federal structure. The use of the word federal seems to be an anathema for many Europeans. It is worth remembering that with the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, inspired by Jean Monnet in 1951, the French government declared that it would provide for the setting up of common foundations for economic development as a first step in the Federation of Europe. What is the way forward? Where is the higher vision to achieve what is imaginable but not yet within reach? I suggest that the answer is to reconcile the various goals of Europeans, what I call the 3 M's: minimizing frictions, maximizing synergies, and maintaining sovereignty. Some believe they can achieve the first 2 without a dilution of sovereignty. That is not possible. From my Canadian experience with Quebec, however, I know that it is possible to minimize frictions and maximize synergies while maintaining cultures and national identities. In the case of Quebec, the French language, civil law, religion, and culture have been protected since the Quebec Act of 1774, which is one reason why separatist movements have never succeeded. I see this kind of flexible federal structure with necessary variations in Europe's future. Loss of Europe's various languages and cultures would alter the character of the continent, moving it in the direction of the United States. The historical evolution and the nature of the self-willed peoples of Europe, as Fisher described them, make that path neither feasible nor desirable. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha.
I'm unmuted.
To give some comments?
Well, you read it very well. I'm glad I didn't do it instead. Of course, there's quite a bit more in the comments which we might discuss. I mean, first of all, this whole issue of moving towards a more federalized state, which seems to be the ambition of the Spinelli group. And maybe somebody can tell me where that's at the moment, because I haven't followed it as closely as I might have. But I also, in that, those of you who have the text that I sent will also see that I closed with a statement from Thierry de Montbrial, who is the founder of IFRI, the Institut Français des Relations Internationales, founder actually and head of it. And just by accident, when I was preparing my comments on multilateralism in Europe, because I believe this is obviously central to the discussion we're having, I quoted him, and I'll just read part of it to you. He says, "But it stands to reason that we in Europe in particular should capitalize on building the union in order to prove the viability of a third way between the United States, that great democracy which still claims to be a liberal one, and the People's Republic of China, which still claims to be communist. Most of us want to remain close to American democracy, but we refuse to become its vassals. Yes. Notably, as part of the Atlantic Alliance, we have retrofitted to that end. There is an urgent need to clarify NATO's truly shared objectives. As for the European Union, despite all the whining in recent weeks, it continues to sail ahead in stormy seas, as it always has. If there is one part of the world where multilateralism is making headway, despite countless hurdles, it is the European Union." That was his comment, which I think is very apropos of the discussion which we're having here.
Thank you, John. And so for the next speaker, the first one in the room would be Dr. Franz Fischler, the former Federal Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, the former EU Commissioner, and the current President of the European Alpbach Forum. Dr. Fischler, the Alpbach Forum this year is focusing on fundamentals. So if you look at the future of Europe, what is fundamentally going to happen, do you think?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What is fundamental? Well, in principle, in the program, there are 3 questions raised, and I think I should try to give to each of these questions a reasonable answer. But before I do that, let me make a short remark, because the first question is exactly the question about the future of Europe, or the future to Europe, as it is called in the program. Here within the European Union, and also here in our country, very often we are very unclear when we speak about Europe, what we really mean. Because very often we use Europe as a kind of synonym for the European Union, and in reality we discuss then only European Union affairs. But the question is much broader. If we discuss Europe, I think at least we must add our candidate countries, our accession countries. And then the question is, how far do we go towards East? Do we include Russia? Do we include Ukraine, Georgia, and others? The next very difficult and very tricky and sensitive question is, what is our future relation with Turkey? Do we accept Turkey as a European country? And then there is, in the meanwhile, also the big question about our future relation with the UK. Yeah? Do we follow the approach of some Brexiteers who say they are living in the middle of the Atlantic and don't belong to the European Union or to Europe? So I think this has to be clarified, because depending on the geographical context, the answer about the future to Europe is rather different. And I think we should be aware of that. The second remark I would like to make is the fact that when I saw the first draft for the program of this conference, COVID-19 was not mentioned, because it was sent out before the crisis started. But now we must be aware of the fact that this crisis, this pandemic, has the potential to fundamentally change Europe and also the whole world. And I think we have before us not easy times, let's say, and we have not a clear view how we should deal with the difficulties we are facing at the moment. It's very interesting that maybe some of you know him, Ivan Krastev. He is a Bulgarian intellectual, and he published a small booklet. I have it here, and the English title of this booklet is It Tomorrow Yet? And his conclusion in his book are that he says we are confronted with 7 different paradoxes. The first paradox is the fact that COVID-19 discloses the dark side of globalization, but at the same time, it is an agent of globalization. The second paradox is that the crisis accelerates deglobalization, but also shows the limits of renationalization. And the third paradox, he says, is that COVID-19 provoked in the beginning national unification, but now it is strengthening the political division. The fourth is that COVID-19 interrupted democracy, but at the same time limited the desire for authoritarian governments. And the fifth conclusion is that in the beginning of the corona crisis, the European Union almost disappeared, at least in the public, but in the future, the EU could become even more important than it was in the past. Sixth, the virus brought back the spirits of the 3 former crises: terrorism, refugee crisis, and financial crisis. But Corona revised their political results. And finally, the pressure of deglobalization could get the Europeans to develop more common strategy and to shift even more competencies to Brussels. And under these auspices and under these conclusions, I would like now to answer the questions. So, is there any alternative to universal and pan-European multilateralism? To be a bit provocative, I would say yes, there is. Because what is mentioned in these first 3 paradoxes underlines that this possibility is there, cannot be excluded or ignored. Another question is whether we have a lot of sympathy for such solutions, but we must face reality here. And the strengthening of nationalism supported by populistic ideas is more likely at the moment than a further huge increase in deepening our democratic systems. I would go so far and say, well, the risk of disintegration is not only there, it is growing at the moment and not diminishing. And one other aspect, when we speak about multilateralism, especially in the trade context, I mean, the reality is, if we look back what happened in, let's say, last 15 years, I haven't seen many even almost no multilateral trade agreement anymore. What we had were only bilateral trade agreements and nothing else. So at the same time, we see a weakening of the WTO institutions, also provoked by people like the American president and others. And therefore, I was a former chief negotiator for agriculture international trade. So therefore, I know what I'm speaking about, because this is the most conflicting area in trade relations. But as important as it is to come back to a multilateral approach, or to start a new trade round, or to strengthen the WTO institutions, I don't see in the capitals around Europe and also outside Europe a big will to do it. And as long as there is not enough political will to change our behavior in trade relations, I don't see that we have a good chance that multilateralism is high up in the agenda in the future. The second question, recalibrating the Euromed and cross-continental affairs. I would like to quote here an Austrian politology professor, Ulrike Gero, and she said in one of her books, we have given up our ambition to move towards convergence. So the convergence goal is no longer an important and fundamental goal in the European Union. Also, it is written down and enshrined in our treaties. The cohesion policy, the structural policy, the regional policy, these were the instruments in the past how we would have liked to achieve more convergence. But these instruments are weaker than they were in the past, and we don't see that the inequality within the European Union is going down. The opposite, it is going up. And the third point, the future to Europe. Our traditional hypothesis of the ever closer union, or the final aim to end up with the United States of Europe, this is something which is no longer on the agenda. Not only because of Brexit, also for other reasons. And therefore, I think it is really very, very urgent that we try to find new approaches, how we can deepen the European integration process and how we can make progress in further integration. One possibility is that we, for example, would again intensify the enlargement process. Another way to support integration would be that we look for possibilities of partial integration. For example, all forms of cooperation in the research area or in the technology areas. There, cooperation is easier. Or when we look at the possibilities, how we can have a common position in our international institutions, so that we speak at least in these international institutions with one voice and not with 10 or more different voices. Another way would be that we try to make progress, not in the way that we say, well, the unanimous voting in the foreign policy, this we have to do away with it. In an ideal case, yes, but if we start with that, we will not be successful. So we have to identify ways where in parts of this foreign policy, unanimous decisions are not really necessary, and therefore that there is a certain opportunity to get rid of this obligation of unanimous decisions. And here I think it would also be good reflecting, because here we are in the diplomatic academy, reflecting about possibilities, how we can strengthen European or at least EU common diplomatic initiatives and activities. For example, I think it is a big mess and a big disadvantage that we don't have any soft diplomacy in the European Union and in European affairs. I think this has to be changed, and this is neither costly nor very conflicting. So why don't we do it? Or another question which I think is really, should really intensively discussed, is that we at least introduce on a voluntary basis a European passport and manage this passport commonly. So all I would like to say here is that there are possibilities out there, and the question is more, as always in these times, is there enough political will to do it? Thank you.
And we're moving on to our final virtual speaker, and that is Nasser Kamel, the former Deputy Foreign Minister of Egypt for North Africa and Middle Eastern Affairs, and the current Secretary General of the Union of the Mediterranean. So, Mr. Kamel, are you online? It's pre-recorded. Okay, then let's listen to the recording of his speech, please.
Good.
He is live.
Yeah. Thank you very. Can you hear me?
And we can hear you now. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me with you today. I would have liked to be physically present in this very prestigious panel alongside renowned international experts and former international personalities. And I would like to start by thanking IFIMES and also, of course, the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna for giving me this opportunity. Being the Secretary General of the Union for the Mediterranean and being someone from the Southern Mediterranean region, I will focus my intervention on the part of the title of today's panel, which is revisiting and recalibrating the Euro-Med relation, but also in relation, of course, to the future of Europe. And I dare say, maybe to provoke the discussion, that I'm a true believer, for someone who spent more than 30 years serving my country in Europe, that the future of Europe is closely linked to its neighborhood. And by neighborhood, I do not limit that to the Mediterranean or to the Southern Mediterranean, but I mean also the Eastern neighborhoods. I dare say that the relevance and weight of Europe as an economic, normative, and a geopolitical player would depend on the future of its relation with its neighborhood, or what I will call its ecosystem from an economic and geopolitical standpoint. As the previous speakers have mentioned, the Americas, and in the center of it, the USA, is one bloc that is playing a very important role in today's world, and the rising power of China and Southeast Asia as the second bloc that is going to be a very relevant player in tomorrow's world, both economically and geopolitically. So for Europe to remain relevant, I would say it needs more integration with its neighborhood, including Turkey, as it was previously mentioned, but also the whole southern Mediterranean and the eastern neighborhood. And it's extremely apparent and obvious today while we're facing the challenge of COVID-19, which has shown the limits of our ability as individual states to deal with the socio-economic.
No, we can't hear you.
The sound has died here.
Mr. Nasser, your mic is not working.
Can you say something? We can't hear you, no.
Thing different.
Yeah, now it's working again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, now. Good.
Okay, thank you very much. So coming back to COVID-19 and the Euromed region, I mean, we all, and I don't need to repeat what we all know in terms of the devastating impact of this pandemic on our economies, but also the fact that it had an even more dire consequences in our particular region. And by our region, I mean the Euro-Mediterranean region. No region has been more hard hit than Europe and the Southern Mediterranean by this crisis. In view of the nature of the economic activity in our region, the importance of tourism to many of our economies, and the numbers speak for themselves. So our region is facing today a triple challenge. One that is directly related to COVID-19. The second one is what I call the climate emergency that this region is facing. We at the Union for the Mediterranean helped commission a study done by 85 prominent scientists from all over the world on the impact of climate change in the Euro-Mediterranean region. And the results, to say the least, were alarming. We are warming 20% faster than the rest of the world. 10 out of the 20 most affected cities by climate change are Mediterranean cities, north and south. The sea level, I'm talking about the Mediterranean, is expected to rise somewhere between 50 centimeters to 1 meter the next 20 to 25 years. So we have an economic, social challenge with COVID-19. We have an emergency in terms of climate change. And we have the underlying inequalities within the nation states in our countries, but between the north and the south in the region at large. And I dare say our response will determine to a great extent the future of Europe, but the future of the whole region. If we move into a logic of a collective response, a logic of enhancing collaboration and cooperation, a logic of building a collective family of nations between the EU on one part and the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean, we stand a better chance to be one of those who represent the future of our world. And I will explore with you a couple of points which were actually very eloquently presented by Mr. Franz Fischer. He talked about the paradoxes of the pandemic. One of the paradoxes he spoke about was the tendency to deglobalize or to nationalize. Well, I tend to agree that although the pandemic was global in nature and was actually, in a sense, caused by our increasingly globalized world, and although I am a believer that globalization will not die or recede because of this particular crisis, but also I'm a firm believer that this crisis has taught us a very important lesson, which is our need to build a much more resilient ecosystem within our region. And by that, I mean a more self-reliance on a regional level. We have very much witnessed that the crisis has exposed our extreme dependency on supply chains heavily dominated by Asian and, to be more blunt, by Chinese production and supply chain capacities. So my proposal, which is not really mine, is but the logical response to that reality is that we need to reconsider this current model and the economic dynamics behind it, and explore in details the possibility of what we call today onshoring our supply chain and make it more national and more regional. And I think the region as a whole, and here I'm still within the confine of the neighborhood, Eastern and Mediterranean, to be able to build a more secure and stable economic and supply chain system. Here at the UFM, at the Union for the Mediterranean, we're working towards that, and we have already we are already proposing to our member states, and we're collaborating very closely with OECD in this venue. The second proposition, I think, that should and will determine what direction Europe will take, which will not be, as you rightly mentioned before me, that of the US model or of the Chinese model, would be how we're going to rebuild after the crisis. As someone in the Commission have said recently, we need to rebuild better. We need a green recovery. And when I talked about the climate emergency we're facing in the Euromed region, I would come back to that by saying our approach to rebuild, to recover from the economic and social effects of the COVID-19 has to be one that focuses more on sustainability, on increasing investment in what we call the green economy, the blue economy, the circular economy, and not to limit that to the borders of the EU as such, but to be more generous in our approach, because climate do not know boundaries and is affecting all of us. And this recovery also should be one that focuses on dealing with the inequalities, as I mentioned in the beginning of my intervention, between the North and the South, but also within our society, depending on the activity of some segment of the population compared to others. So my proposition is extremely simple. We need, as a larger community of nations comprising Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Mediterranean, to start thinking regionally, to start working towards a cohesive region and one that is focused on conversion, as you rightly said, Mr. Fisher, and through these two instruments. One, more regional economic integration by means of onshoring, or the very bad English word being used today, which is proximization of supply chain, to bring them closer to our land and to our countries. And the second one, to have a comprehensive approach towards a recovery that is green-led and that is sustainable, that will allow us not only to rebuild better, but also to protect ourselves from future challenges and future pandemics, because we know that climate change has a relation, a very direct relation to the possibility of future pandemics, not to mention the natural calamities that our region have faced in the last few years due to climate change. So in short, three messages. Europe needs its neighborhood as much as the neighborhood needs Europe, so we can all together be a relevant geopolitical, economic, and normative power in a rapidly changing world. Two, we need to do this while taking into consideration a climate emergency that we're facing, and that tomorrow's economy is by definition, or must be by definition, a greener, bluer, more digitalized, and low emission economy. And for that, the approach should be also regional and encompassing the two neighborhoods of this great project that I call the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamal. And then last but not least, we have Mario Holzer with us. He is the Director General of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and a lecturer for applied econometrics at the University of Vienna. Mr. Holzer, we hope to hear a more economic perspective from your end and how we could maybe integrate the European idea.
Thank you very much. I've prepared a few slides. I wonder whether I can manage them myself, or I'm just waving my hands maybe.
Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, recently my institute, the Vienna Institute for National Economic Studies, has published together with the IMK from Düsseldorf and the OFC from Paris a proposal for the European COVID-19 recovery program. And we titled it "How to Spend It," because so far the discussion was mostly about how to finance it and not so much about, well, what actually to do with such a fund. And hence, if I may have the next slide, here comes our suggestion. This is the suggested architecture of this program. We assumed, following also what the European Parliament suggested, a 2 trillion euro recovery fund over the period, basically next year until 2030. And two big pillars. One is a national pillar, about 500 billion for the short run, the next 3 years. And that would basically be along the lines that also the Commission has suggested. Basically relief for the member states, and particularly relief for the most affected member states, with a key for distribution there are also suggestions by the Commission on that. But what we focused on in our paper was another pillar, an EU pillar, the bigger part, 1,500 billion for a longer period, a decade, but genuinely European projects should be supported with a European and EU value added connected to that. We have made three bigger suggestions. One is a health for EU agency that would organize in a new way a pan-European health policy, develop also the skills of healthcare workers in all of Europe, and also coordinate the distribution of these people in cases of crisis, plus a number of important investments in European healthcare infrastructure. The Commission has identified huge gaps in European healthcare infrastructure already before the pandemic. So that would be quite a large chunk of this EU pillar, about 400 billion. Then we suggest also to front load the existing plans for 100% renewable energy sources e-highway that would basically connect the production areas of wind energy in the north and also the potential production areas of solar energy in the south of the Union with the respective needed investments in the electricity grid, and that would cover basically about half of the costs we assumed in this first decade of about 260 billion, and additional 290 billion of support to mitigate the climate risk. There is a number of programs that could be thought of here. And finally, and here I want to also focus on in the later few slides, we suggest an ultra-rapid train network. Again, the first half of investments for a decade of about 550 billion. If I may ask for the next slide. Speaking about high-speed rail and transport policy in general, it's not like nothing happened in the European Union. There is, since the 1990s, so-called 10T transport network. Various corridors are defined, as can be seen on this map. And there is a slow expansion of this. There is always extension of this corridor here and there. There are 50 billion from this source, 70 billion from that source, stretched over the period of the multi-annual financial frameworks. So, I mean, it's not nothing, but it's rather a slow organic increase of this network. And if I may ask for this next slide again, the current situation is, in terms of rail, for instance, that Europe does not really have a high-speed rail network at this point in time. This is the general rail network in Europe, and you may or may not see it. There are a few lines here in pink, and that's basically in France a little bit, and a little bit in Spain, and here and there a little bit. These are the lines where trains can go faster than 300 kilometers per hour. And so that's really just a very tiny, one can't even say really a network, because it typically hardly ever crosses national borders. So obviously, if you compare that to what China produced in the last decade or so, they have now basically 80% of the high-speed rail network of the whole world, really fairly recently built. So on the next slide, I also want to mention that in general, it is quite difficult. Rail cross-border travel is quite difficult in Europe. You may know there are huge technical differences in a number of issues. This is, for instance, a map that shows the different railway track gauges in Europe. Or on the next slide, for instance, we see the different rail electrification systems in Europe, partly even within the same country. you have different electrifications. And this is just a tiny part of the differences that exist. So the idea is basically probably you need to have for really a European high-speed rail network one common system. And on the next slide is a tentative map of our suggested ultra-rapid train network that connects all EU capitals, plus also the capitals of the Western Balkan accession countries. Obviously, some of the connections will be commercially more viable and others certainly less. There are also some ceilings which make it obviously also more difficult for some of the lines, for instance, connecting Ireland and Cyprus. But the major lines, including some loops we have included here, could connect really, I think, important parts of the European urban regions. On the next slide, I've summed up the key points of this. It should be a new complementary double-track high-speed railway system that partly can use also existing lines, but generally probably needs to be in addition, about 18,000 kilometers. And in a, I think, rather conservative estimate, we come up with costs of about 1.1 trillion euros, assuming on average some 60 million per kilometer. The current tracks of high-speed rail without tunnels cost about 25 million per kilometer. Cumulative, this would be about 7.5% of GDP, of EU GDP. But if you spread that around, on 1 or 2 decades, then per annum, this is really not a big amount for Europe or for the EU as a whole. Average speed should be somewhere around 250 to 350 kilometers per hour. This is technically in principle possible since the 60s, 70s already. And for instance, Paris-Berlin would be possible to manage in less than 4 hours. Currently, it takes about 8 hours to go by train from Paris to Berlin. And with this reduction, I think we could reduce a whole lot of intra-EU air traffic. And if we assume about half of the current intra-EU commercial air traffic, then this would lead to massive global CO2 emission reductions of 4 to 5 percentage points just by this intervention. It would also obviously also in the medium to longer term counter the economic fallout from the current crisis, because this crisis will not end next year. There will be long run effects of this crisis, and I think from a European macroeconomic point of view, we need some European projects that improve the expectations of the economic agents. I think even more importantly, this would be a measure to provide EU citizens with a very concrete benefit that everyone, at least those people living in the big cities, could benefit from. And it would be not an anonymous EU project, one more of those when nobody really knows what happens. It would be a pan-European activity to also foster integration and cohesion, or also of the poorer parts, and connect them to the richer parts. It could be a lighthouse project in support of the European Green Deal. And finally, it could also create another European champion in the transport industry and help also to gain technological leadership in this area. So with the final slide, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so that lets us open the floor to questions from the audience. I have 2 questions from online for 2 of our panelists, but if there are questions in the audience, please raise your hands. And yes, we have one question, please. Yes, just, there's the mic, yes. Very short and sweet, please. And if you could address the panelists you want to answer, please.
Karl from Institute of the Danube Region. I will have a question to Mr. Meyer-Holzner concerning high-speed trains, etc., and connections from energy production, North Sea, for instance, to the south. What about the legislation? I mean, current legislation, as we all know, it takes sometimes decades to get projects done. So what about the legislation? Thank you.
Well, I think there we are again what Dr. Fischler already said. It's a matter of political will. I mean, you could have also common European legislation for special projects, which, I mean, in principle, it is possible, but you're absolutely right. It's but it is the European tragedy, if you wish. So the fragmentation of the legal space also in many ways, and the problem of having cross-border, truly cross-border investment. So there is certainly not an easy fix to that. I'm well aware of that. So it's a matter of political will.
Any further questions? While you think, I'll ask the questions we have from online. These are from the Accra University of Economics in Ghana. We have a question for Dr. Fischler. That is, if I can read this handwriting, is there an equivalent policy possible for Africa? And I don't know what this should refer to. Agriculture. Is there a common agriculture policy possible for Africa? Sorry, I can hard time reading.
Well, this is a very interesting question, because when we speak about Africa, and I personally believe that we Europeans would be well advised to cooperate much more with Africa than we do so far, because the African continent has the biggest potential worldwide, and we are the closest continent to Africa. So who else is better prepared or better off than Europe to increase in African cooperation? But here it is like with this high-speed train. Yeah? We have to think about new ways. We have the Cotonou Agreement and all these traditional elements about cooperation with Africa, but these are drops in the sea and not much more. Yeah? So we need a new approach, and to come to agriculture and to a common agricultural policy. I think in Africa, and I speak here primarily with about Sub-Saharan Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, you have still hundreds of millions very small farms. They are only they produce only for their own families, and there is no market, and they are the most vulnerable farmers, vulnerable about pests, about weather conditions, about market changes, and so on and so forth. So I think we have to look first what we should do with them, and we should give up our traditional European behavior that we teach them what they should do. I think we should first and foremost listen to them and find out what their real needs are and what their thinking is, and then together maybe we can then change things. I think there's no other way than to make progress. What I don't believe is that we should favor projects with big production plants with very modern technologies, with a GPS system, with genetically modified seed varieties and so on and so forth. I think this is not what they need, and this is not the way how we can make progress there. This is, I would say, to some degree, the Chinese way how they would like to develop African agriculture. And we should do it differently. And on the other hand, the disadvantage here is, or the problem is, that we must speed up. Yeah? The population, the African population is growing very fast. And the big risk is that we are already very late, and we could then be, if we don't accelerate these things, we could be too late.
Thank you. And then unless there's another question from the audience? No. The second question, also from Aqua University for Mr. Holzner. Do you think is the new Green Deal for Africa possible?
It's
yes or no, please.
It's almost impossible for Europe. So, but maybe difficult to say. I mean, there are projects like this green belt in sub-Saharan space and so on. I guess there are also different types of green policies necessary for Africa and for other regions.
Great. Thank you. If there, oh yeah, we have one more question, Mr. Banerjee, I think. They won't hear us online if you don't.
If I, in the meantime, if I may add only one little thought, I think because there is also a link to the trade policy in the agricultural production sector, and I think it's really necessary. And here, the Africans are waiting for an initiative from the Europeans to introduce measures where you can collect taxes at the border if the way of production of goods is not in line with the requirements of a new Green Deal. And here, because the Africans have a much lower level of climate of measures in place which support climate change, I think it would be easier for Africans to participate in such a border tax system than, for example, for Chinese or Americans, or especially for Brazilians, for example.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Just wanted to reflect or discuss this with you. I've been working on the new national spatial strategy of Japan the last month, and actually just finished the paper this morning. So I'm very full of this. But what Japan is facing now is an extraordinary shift of the demography. It's like 1/3 of Japanese population is going to vanish in the next 20 to 30 years. And this is the third largest economy of the world. And so after like 30 years of neglect, I mean, we know that countries neglect depopulation. It's a very interesting phenomenon. We don't want to see ourselves as vanishing or whatever, right? Now, they've come up with a very, very powerful national spatial strategy, a new one, where they have two layers. One is they call it the Grand Vision 2050, which is for 40 to 50 years, and the National Spatial Strategy, which is about 10 years. Now, the first one has principles of transformation, and the second one is the strategic implementation of this idea. Now, they've created very simple narratives, which every citizen can understand. That's also interesting that they have created imagery which is comprehensible to all. And they say it's compaction and networking. The compaction is about right-sizing the cities. It's not about shrinking. They're talking about smart shrinking. So all their narratives have changed from being something negative, disappearing, and so on, into positive. So smart shrinking, right-sizing of cities, their entire service, like public services, they have imagined of serving centralizing their services for, let's say, 10,000 people in villages, and cooperation between the localities, so they're creating a new local economy, particularly on the agricultural level, like local production. And the other level is decentralizing the economy and centralizing their services. And what I find really interesting is that they're not saying that these small areas don't have to compete in the global economy, but that can, Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka will do that, but the local regions can do their little stuff. I find this really interesting that within a single country that they have a differentiated approach to economic production. Now my question is, because you presented the high-speed trains, and Japan is working on high-speed trains as well. However, their entire mobility strategy and their entire innovation policy strategy is embedded in this big national spatial strategy. And they're connecting strategic spaces with a certain designation of what these spaces should do in the future. So don't you think we need that we need to embed such high-speed trains, which is absolutely necessary, I'm completely with you, but we have to connect this with a bigger understanding of economic development, spatial development, social development, and so on.
We're going to keep it very short, please.
Very short, oh, sure. Well, that's again the difference between a nation state with certain also ideas of homogeneity, but also maybe differences within the structure, and a union of a number of nation states with a sense of heterogeneity and the importance of each state's capital city or major industrial centers. So I think, given the way how Europe looks like, that type of Japanese approach will not really be possible for us, although it might be, in theory, a good idea to have. So it will not say that, I don't know, a certain capital city will not be connected to something that we want to have as a common infrastructure, if that touches a bit upon your question.
All right, we are 2 minutes over our allotted 90 minutes, and I would like to ask just very briefly, I think they should all still be online. Yes. Everybody mentioned that we needed reforms, so I would like each panelist to pick the one thing we should reform first as their concluding remark, and you get 15 seconds each, please. I would like to start with Lamberto, if you're still there.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. Yes, maybe a couple of quick points. One, there was a lot of attention on the EU, and I think that's well deserved. But of course, when you talk about Europe in general, that's not enough. In the EU, there is the community, la méthode communautaire applies to areas of competence of the Commission, but when it comes to policy areas or defense and security, you fall into the intergovernmental field, and that's where the renationalization of policies exposes even more the differences that are at the basis of the difficulty also of having broad agreed strategies. So certainly that's one area of attention. The second is that you need to keep the larger dimension in mind. I mentioned Russia and Eastern Europe also, a need to find new ways to work in spite of the difficulties, but to work in a broader space than just the process of European integration, or see how this can be expanded. And reaching out on the other side of the Mediterranean certainly is important. Also in the OSCE, we have a Mediterranean dialogue. These are indications of processes that can work, that can bring in other actors like Turkey, but also Russia and others. Final point, regional organizations can play an important role. It's good that we heard some African voices. Global policies need to be shaped also in light of regional priorities and regional specificities. So while it's good to invest in large strategies like the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., but we need to see how they are tailored at the regional level and empower more regional organizations to engage and to support the UN in their implementation.
Thank you. Donald?
Yes, thank you. I just want to make a couple of quick points. So I agreed with Mr. Fisher, especially on the definition, and of course that's touched upon by the last speaker as well to some degree. But I'm concerned and a bit disappointed to hear that notions of greater and deeper integration are not really going to change or anything that Europe is currently doing. For example, Mr. Fisher referred to, well, we could have something in research and development on a multilateral basis. Well, we do. There are 28 countries interconnected in scientific research in Europe, and they produce 1/3 of the world's research, 34% more than the United States and more than China. That exists now. And that's one of the concerns in the UK is an important player in that. And the question is, will that be compromised in the ability of the Europeans to cooperate in that regard? Well, we have to have a lot more of that, in my view. Who's going to speak for Europe? We talk about trade, we talk about dealing with Africa. I mean, the Commission is going to have to be substantially strengthened, and people are going to have to surrender, countries are going to have to surrender more sovereignty. Who's going to lead the trade negotiations? And also his reference to, I think, disintegration. Well, you've had 2 elections, one in Austria, and that right-wing populist movement did not win, nor did it win in Greece, despite the challenges that the Greeks had at the moment. So I don't think that the Brexit had any kind. It wasn't Brexit, and it wasn't Austria either. So I'm a bit more optimistic, but I'm not in Europe, of course, although I've lived there a great deal. And I'm a passionate believer in the future of the Union for the reasons that I discussed earlier. So I would be disappointed. You may well be right, but I would be very disappointed if Europe does not consolidate, does not have more convergence, does not have a good International Securities Commission, does not have a good FDA, does not have all these things, all of which demand a surrender of some sovereignty.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher?
Thanks. No, you gave me 15 seconds. I used it.
Perfect. Thank you.
My answer to the question, what should we do first, is I think most important is we have to transform our way of thinking. What we need is new thinking first. On the part of this new thinking is that we are better able to deal with complexity. And only then I think we will find the right solutions for many areas where transformation is absolutely necessary. So we must give up this silo thinking, this disciplinary thinking, and we have to look at systems, or in a more system way, system approach to solve certain problems. So for example, as important as it is to introduce high-speed transport and to introduce new infrastructure, not only in Europe, also in the world, but this must always be embedded in the overall society and in our economic system, because only then, if the benefits can be realized by the ordinary people, only then they are prepared to follow such ideas.
Thank you. Mr. Kamel?
Thank you. Well, what we need to do is to keep on pushing the new Green Deal as a priority and not let the current crisis derail our resolve. What we need to do is, yes, of course, more intra-European integration, cohesion, and cementing the Union, but not with the view of building Europe as a fortress, but also a Europe that is proactive, engaged with its neighborhood. And I would add to that neighborhood what you mentioned earlier, Africa, which is the fastest growing continent economically and demographically. And when we look at you use the example of Japan and the demographics in Japan. Well, the demographic in Europe are also declining rapidly, and Europe needs to be looking beyond its borders to deal with a world characterized by the emergence of blocks. So more economic integration with the neighborhood and Africa, and more integration within Europe itself. Thank you very much.
Mr. Holzner?
Yes, so I would also suggest to change thinking, think more in a more systematic way, like Dr. Fischer just said. But maybe as a second step, I would suggest to introduce a substantial and permanent budget for the euro area, at least in this order of 5 to 10% of GDP. Otherwise, I don't see how we can stop the erosion of the European Union, and we won't have the last exit with Brexit, but many more will follow.
Well, thank you very much for your patience in the audience. Thank you very much for the panelists for their very insightful contributions. Thank you very much. And I think there's a musical performance next. So over to you, Professor.
Just before we come to the, let's say, the most pleasant part of the evening, which is the gastro journey and music journey, on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank to everyone. First of all, next to me, the panelists of the third panel, distinguished representative from Ban Ki-moon office who was mastering the panel perfectly, also of course panelists. So that means on behalf of International Institute of IFEMES, on behalf of Modern Diplomacy as the magazine, on behalf of the European Perspectives, which is more, let's say, the academic magazine, Culture for Peace, the Viennese here headquartered cultural initiative, and also Diplomatic Academy, who was also our co-organizer. I would like to thank to each and every of you. Now to disclose you what was happening while we've been preparing conference, as Excellency Fischler was telling when we approached him for the first time, that was in a good old times. So in the meantime, there was, of course, a lot of adaptations, but there was also a sort of a growing interest in getting things together. And then one of the most frequently repeated questions was, do not organize conference. Let's start with the process. Let's start something which will be providing people with let's say with a forum, with a place to meet and to say. So we put something on a paper as a sort of a communique or whatever, which is very optional. So nobody is forced to. There is no some sort of a membership fee or whatever. And our colleague, Professor Zeno from London's College, will just read those couple of words as a final, let's say, deliberation in a way which is very mild and very general, but very colloquial, very embracing and forward-looking. So by having said that, there is also something which we have to apologize to, especially to our audience, on our digital audience from all over the globe. Some of them were getting very late in the evening. Some of them, like Steve Clements or people in Argentina and Chile, they got up very early to watch us. So we really have to excuse that we didn't accommodate every and each question. And related to what we embodied in communique, there was also coming as an idea that practically each and every of the speakers of panel 1, 2, and 3 should be invited by one leading university of our partners, and we should have one-on-one digital discussion. So practically, I think then, because in 10, 15 minutes, when we are all stressed whether the internet will work, whether the panelists are here, and how the order of presence goes. So I think it was rather hectic and nervous. And what we owe to audience, but also to panelists, is that little that we organize at least one-to-one. And I want to deposit this also with excuse to our audiences. As I said, from Chile to Far East and from Canada to Australia, who were, let's say, passionately and patiently listening and today with us, although we haven't seen many of them, and they will not enjoy the dinner, the beautiful dinner and, that we have, and excellent Austrian wines. Don't go home, try wines before you go, and the dinner. So finally, by closing, so Professor Zeno, if you can just you can go to booth or as you wish. All right. I don't know if the mic works on the booth. Well, then take a seat here.
It does. Okay. Okay, thank you. So, reaffirming that the post-World War II European rapprochement and consensus over the historical facts remain a fundamental block for any presence and future of stability and prosperity to the entire European continent and Euromed theater. Reassessing that the unprecedented length of peace and stability in Europe was and is only thanks to successful confidence-building measures. And reassessing that these confidence building measures are successful when the continent decides to rest on a single and unified version of modern history as the only way to achieve the truth and reconciliation in Europe. Alerting that any rewriting of history and trivialization of affirmed facts-based past is a way to disorientation, antagonization, fragmentation, and dangerous weakening of Europe. Recalling the need for a constructive and engaging European policy, especially towards its neighbors and peripheral Europeans, South, Southeast, and East. Given that since Brexit, the EU-Europe becomes smaller and more fragile, while the non-EU Europe grows detached and disenfranchised. Noting that pan-Europeanism has no alternative, but it works out within the Council of Europe, Oecd, EU, and other institutions, as well as via people-to-people exchange mechanism as the best way to strengthen and further excel participation in and horizontalization of Europe. Wishing to support and promote fairness as well as the balance of social, political, cross-generational and geographic Europe, continent for all, continent of common past and continent future for all, common future for all. Thus, determined to continue with such events as a way to promote the above stated, based on thorough exchanges between partners and participants before and during this conference, the four partnering organizers and their associated partners are calling upon all willing, engaged, and concerned to join in turning this periodic event into a process, tentatively named as Vienna Process, Common Future, One Europe. The first follow-up of the Vienna process is scheduled for the end of September 2020 to honor the process and to mark the 75th anniversary of San Francisco Conference and the creation of Universal Organization of the UN, too. Vienna, 1st of July 2020. Thank you.